So I'm joining you from the Cotswold National Landscape under the Glorious Cotswold Grasslands team, and I'm going to be taking you through a bit of programme background to start with, how we came about, and why we do what we do. So the Cotswold National Landscape is a designated area of outstanding natural beauty. It was designated in 1966, and it's basically land protected under law for the purposes of conserving and enhancing the natural beauty of the area. We're a small staff team, and we work on a number of different themes around nature conservation, climate, and engaging with the community. And we're lucky to be supported by a massive team of voluntary wardens, over 350 wardens, and other teams of volunteers who help us deliver the work. So the Glorious Cotswold Grasslands programme started in 2019. It was originally planned to be a 3-year programme funded by Esme Fairburn, and it was following on from the Save Our Magnificent Meadows project, which was kind of led by Plant Life, but it was a amalgamation of 11 organisations that came together to do work around grassland restoration. And it was so successful and was found to have so much need that the Glorious Cotswold Grasslands was formed. In 2022, we were made permanent by the CNL based off the continued kind of work that we were doing and success of what we were doing. And we're now in our 6th year funded through a combination of grants and partnerships and the sale of our seed and services. So what we primarily do is to create and restore wildflower-rich grassland across the Cotswolds, working with a wide variety of clients. And we've worked with landowners, farmers, schools, charities, community groups, parish and town councils, and businesses as well. So a huge number of different people in the landscape. And so this is the Cotswold National Landscape, or the designation of the AONB. It's a huge area, so kind of up near Banbury in the north and down to Bath at the bottom. And in yellow, we have the areas where we've carried out our restoration work. So if you were to add all of these areas up, it's over 500 hectares of land that we've restored, and that's around 1,200 acres. And you can see that there's a sort of cluster around the north, so quite a lot more opportunity down in the south. And then if we zoom in a little bit more locally, you can see that these are the sites where we've worked in kind of close to Wootton. But for every area that we have carried out a restoration, obviously there are many more areas where we could work and where we like to work because we've got such a vast landscape which we're trying to cover. So just before we kind of go any further, just to explain some points around what I mean when I talk about creation and restoration and these terms kind of species-rich grassland. So we can create grasslands, and this tends to be in situations where we have bare soil sites. So we talk about something called arable reversion, which is where we can take land that was previously used in arable farming and crop fields, and we can obviously introduce the seed with the wildflowers and the grasses that we specifically want to introduce. So we've done work around that where we have done arable reversion, but also where we've had landscaping projects and land use change. But we can also do grassland restoration. And grassland restoration is where we're taking habitat that is already existing grassland, and there may be some remnant wildflowers, but for a variety of different reasons, it will have lost its kind of species richness and diversity. So we'll only see a sort of small number of dominant grasses left in that habitat, and we're looking to restore that to something much more diverse. So this could be because of the way that grassland's been managed. So perhaps it's been cut with the cuttings left on, and those have gone into the ground to fertilise the ground. It might be because it's been over or undergrazed, or possibly because there's been some historic fertiliser use or herbicide use. And in these situations, what we're looking to do is overseeding. So we're introducing wildflower seed into the grassland with the aim of obviously reintroducing that diversity that we want to see within those grasslands. And within the Glorious Cotswold Grasslands programme, we do both of these things. So we we both create and restore grassland, but the restoration of grasslands is kind of the mainstay of what we do. And then I've talked about management of grasslands. So this is because grasslands are habitats that need management to actually exist. So this is because we have a process called succession, and this is where different species and communities change over time, and they replace each other until we reach what's called the climax community. And in our situation, that's woodland, so mature woodland. So from the interglacial period, we had large amounts of woodland or forest covering our landmass. And during those times, we had open areas that were maintained as grassland, but through a variety of sort of natural means. So that might have been that we had large herbivores that were grazing and keeping those areas open. It might have been in woodland where we had clearings that developed because of tree fall or forest fire. There were also sort of marshy situations where the ground was too wet for trees to really get established. Or on the other side of that, maybe on limestone soil where we had very thin soil on hard rock where the trees were regenerating very slowly. And so we had these sort of natural grasslands. But when humans started being able to farm our environment, and we developed the ability to be able to take cuts and to domesticate livestock and graze areas, we were able to vastly increase the amount of these open spaces that we have to keep them open as grasslands. And we therefore call grasslands a sort of semi-natural habitat. So that means that they do need that sort of element of management to stop that process of succession. And they're not a stable ecological state if they're left on their own. So what tends to happen is that we get the dominant grasses that start to take over. So they thrive really well in sort of nutrient-enriched and highly fertile soils. So when you stop cutting and grazing, the grasses die back, put the nutrients that they had in the matter back into the ground, and that tends to be taken up by those same species that tend to take over. And so then you see the introduction of kind of woody species, so you get brambles and then you get scrub, and then it moves on until you eventually have woodland. So we therefore do have to do some sort of interventional management to keep our grasslands open. And then we've got this term species-rich wildflower grasslands. Well, there's lots of different types of grasslands, and we've got an example on the left there of what you might typically see on a sort of lawn or an amenity green space. And these are what we call modified grasslands. So these are grasslands that tend to exist on fertile soils where you have a small number of really fast-growing species and not a lot of diversity. But when we talk about our species-rich wildflower grasslands, we're talking about a sort of array of different species, a community of species that can tolerate the different conditions in the ground. So that might be the different types of soils that we have and the hydrological regimes as well. And broadly speaking, the different types of grasslands that we're talking about in this category are our floodplain meadows. So we've got an example photograph of a floodplain meadow here. And you can see there some beautiful colours and a sort of suite of indicator species that we call them that are indicative that this is the type of habitat that we have. And obviously these are found on our river and tributary floodplains. So these tend to be characterised by fertile soils because of those flood events where we get vast amounts of nutrients and silts that are deposited on the ground when it floods. And these species can tolerate those conditions, but also periods of waterlogging and inundation on the soil as well. Then we've got our neutral grasslands. So these are much more grassy grasslands, but they are herb-rich and species-rich as well. And we get these on neutral soils. And then we have our calcareous grasslands. So these are characterised by being on soils that are high in calcium carbonate from weathering of limestone or chalk rock. And they tend to be on sort of thin soils, free draining, but these are ones that we get a lot in the Cotswolds because of the limestone that we're on. And so we've worked a lot with these types of grasslands specifically. So we also have acid grassland on acidic soils, but we haven't worked quite so much with that because we do tend to have these characteristic high wolds on sort of limestone plateaus around the Cotswolds, fading down into these sort of low low levels of land where we have neutral grassland and floodplain meadows. So those are our specific types of grasslands that we're working with. So what do we do with these grasslands? Well, we can provide advice on the best management of grasslands and suitability for restoration. And we can provide advice on the funding to do that. We can also undertake botanical surveys. And then, crucially, we collect wildflower seed from donor sites across the Cotswolds, and we use that for our restoration projects and our creation of grasslands. And then we also undertake practical habitat management to stop that process of succession, to keep grasslands open where perhaps the management isn't being carried out or isn't going quite as well as we want it to. So I will go into all of those things in a little bit more detail, but before I do that, I want to try and explain why there's a need for this and why we're doing what we do. So we'll start with nature's recovery. So this is a term that you might have heard quite a lot recently, and this is because we realise now that it's not enough to just conserve, but we need to start recovering because of the amount of loss that we face. And you may have also heard these terms, bigger, better, more, and more joined up, or some formation of those terms. So they come from the Lawton report. That was published in 2010 and led by Sir John Lawton. And it was undertaken to try and understand what we needed to do with our habitat and our species in order to try and mitigate against the pressures that they would face from climate change. And so the findings of the Lawton report were that we need bigger habitats. So we need to make sure that they are robust enough. We need them to be better quality through better management. We need them to be more, so we need to create more habitat where we can. And we need them to be joined up as well, because we need to, if we want species to be able to adapt to different climate events and changing weather patterns, but also just pressures in the landscape, then we need connectivity to allow species to move and adapt. And we can do that by creating wildlife corridors or stepping stones. So the Gloucestershire Local Nature Partnership has created something called the Natural Capital Platform. And there's a picture of it up there. So you can see on the platform, what we've got is some of our habitats. These are our wildlife sites that I was just mentioning. And you can see that there is some existing connectivity. So maybe where, for example, we've got woodland that follows the sort of edge of the scarp. We've got woodland in green there and open habitat in pink. But you can see that a lot of this habitat is very fragmented. There are sections that are completely isolated, and it's not joined up enough. We don't have what we need from that Lawton report. And this is what we call the Nature Recovery Network. So then this is how we can join up all of those pieces of key habitat that we currently have and make our habitats and species more resilient against climate change. So this is a really, really useful tool. If you haven't looked at it before, it's really useful for identifying where the best opportunities might be for creating habitat and buffering habitat and creating more habitat, especially if you're looking to do something like tree planting or kind of creation of habitat. So really, really good resource. And then just bringing this in a little bit more locally, we've got some local grassland sites, which Belle might be able to, I'll direct you to her if you need more information or if you have questions about those. But we've got Coombe Hill and Wootton Hill, as she mentioned already, triple SI, so already recognised and protected under law because of their nationally important habitat. So this is the calcareous grassland or the limestone grassland that I was mentioning, with a vast array of different species, and we'll look at a few specific species in a moment, but in part designated as well because of the limestone woundwort. It's this guy here. Quite an interesting species because it pops up on woodland edges and in woodland clearings, but it can persist for a really long time as seed in the seed bank and then sort of appear after a bit of disturbance in the ground. But just one of your local rarities. So speaking about rarities, wildflower grasslands, these specific types of grassland that we've talked about, are massively being lost from not just our local area, but on a national scale. And to understand that scale of loss, we need to understand a little bit about the history why we had so many grasslands and why we don't have them anymore. So as just a small part of that, during the Industrial Revolution, apart from our steam railways, a lot of our transport was reliant on horses. And so naturally there was a need for hay. And so we did have lots of hay meadows in our landscape, and these were managed in a traditional way, allowing the grasses to grow long with wildflowers in the mix, and then cutting them once a year in sort of, towards the end of the summer or midsummer, and taking that hay away. And what that did was to keep the ground nutrient poor, which would stop those more competitive grasses from taking hold and from outcompeting the wildflower species. But when the Industrial Revolution was really kind of kicking off, people then began to move into the cities looking for work, and we had less farmers in the landscape. And around the same time, there was also kind of more ability to import food. So there was also a situation where there wasn't quite so much farming. And so there really was quite a lot of ability to have these in the landscape. So we had lots of hay meadows, and it came to a peak around the early 20th century. But obviously things changed and transport moved on, and things became powered by oil and fossil fuels. Also in the Second World War, there was a really big kind of question around food security, and a really big push to make sure that we would be able to grow enough food to feed ourselves. And so land that was previously considered to be kind of marginal or not very good for agriculture was ploughed and was used in food production. And so obviously a lot of these hay meadows went away because of that. But then following on from this, we sort of realised that there were perhaps ways that we could improve our food production. And so there was a lot of research going into varieties of crop species and different grasses and breeding, and also our livestock. And then there was research as well into things like fertilizers, so artificial fertilizers and herbicides. And so all of this kind of culminated in a situation where we saw the loss of our wildflower grasslands across the landscape. And we also realized that we could take silage. So using fertilizers and using these ryegrass varieties of grasses that were very quick to grow, we could take 2 cuts of grass in a year instead of 1. And so again, hay meadows kind of fell to the wayside. And unfortunately, because the loss of this was relatively subtle, in that, when you look across a landscape and in the countryside, you still see green. You might not notice that a wildflower meadow has gone and that there's a silage field there instead. It's not as obvious as cutting down a woodland. And so there was this kind of gradual shift change but a big loss ultimately of lots of our wildflower grasslands. And so we've got some stats there. So in the 1930s, 40% of the AONB was species-rich grassland, and now we've got less than 1.5% remaining. And when we look at the UK's land cover, we've got 29% agriculturally improved grasslands. So that's those kind of modified grasslands with those species, low numbers of species, not very diverse. But we've only got 1% of species-rich grassland. And these grasslands support huge diversity of life. So just within this photograph, we've got a huge array of different colours and shapes and different wildflowers that will smell different and that have adapted in different ways and that fill different ecological niches. And our calcareous grasslands that we have locally, in particular, are really, really known to be very species rich. So within just a metre squared, there can be 40 species of different wildflowers and grasses. And across the timeline of the Glorious Cotswold Grasslands programme, so over the last 5 or so years, we've recorded 371 different species of wildflowers and grasses as well. And we've got some lovely examples here. So we've got the pasque flower, the big sort of purple one in the top right. So this is one of the species that's particularly rare, limited to calcareous grasslands, and known to be sort of holding on locally. So there's a couple of sites that it can be found around Stroud, but also there's another one of these triple SIs up towards Northleach that's designated in part because of a population of pasque flower that's continuing to hang on there. We've got quaking grass. It's come up quite small, but it's sort of in the middle there with lots of blue sky in the photo, but it's a lovely pendulous sort of quivering grass, quaking grass, and it's a really good seed source for farmland birds like yellowhammers and linnets. And then down the bottom left, we have the bee orchid, which is a really fascinating plant. It's a double mimic, so it looks like a bee and it smells like a bee. The idea being that a male bee will land and attempt to mate, and in the process it will pollinate the flower. But unfortunately, again, because of habitat loss, the specific species of bee that does this, it is now only known from about a dozen sites on the south coast. So most of the bee orchids that you'll see are self-pollinated. So if we have all of these different wildflower species, it makes sense that obviously they'll support a huge number of different invertebrates, not just as food plants, but as pollinators. And we know that it's important that we need to support our pollinators, not just for the pollination of the wildflowers and the habitats that we depend on, but also for our food crops and our food plants. And we also know that if we have these different insects in the environment, that they will create more robust food webs. And so if we have more robust food webs, we know that when we have incidences of pests, we are more likely to have the insects that will prey on the pests and have those kind of complete ecological cycles. And we've got some really just fascinating and charismatic species locally. So we've got the rock rose pot beetle, which is known from just a few sites in Dorset, Hampshire and Gloucestershire, and quite locally to here. It's a really beautiful insect, as you can see, but it's quite fascinating. What it needs is calcareous grassland. It needs to be ideally south-facing and sheltered, but it has a thermal requirement, so it needs grasslands that are really warm. So these tend to be the ones that are grazed quite low, so that there's maximum sunlight kind of hitting the ground. So it also needs rock rose, so that's its food plant. And it's called a pot beetle because when it's a larvae, it sort of lives in a little pot or cocoon made out of feces. So it sort of shuffles around in the leaf litter for a while like that, and then becomes an insect, an adult, and feeds on the pollen and the anthers of the flowers. And then we've got another beautiful and charismatic species, the marsh fritillary butterfly. This has declined by 79% since the 1970s, and it's a really sort of vulnerable butterfly species. So it's really vulnerable to weather events and adverse weather, but it also has these really fragile and volatile population dynamics. So it exists in small meta-populations, and what it needs is vast amounts of habitat with connectivity, so that when certain individual populations become extinct, there will be individuals that can move and colonize from these other connected metapopulations, and that way it can kind of continue to survive within the locality. It needs calcareous grassland again, so we do find it on calcareous grassland more locally, but it also likes marshy grassland and kind of shorter coastal grassland. And it's the west is kind of a stronghold for this species, but it's really not doing very well. It needs to be where the food plant is, so that's the food plant underneath the butterfly there, the devil's bit scabious, but it also feeds on other types of scabious as well. And the caterpillars are really fascinating. I've got a little video here of them wriggling around. So they bask in larval webs in the sunshine in late autumn, on these sort of silken webs that they create. So that was me collecting some for a reintroduction project over in South Wales, where there was some remaining habitat, but not the species that could move around between it. It also has a parasitic wasp, the marsh fritillary. Now, this parasitic wasp is probably more rare than the butterfly itself because it has a single host, which is the marsh fritillary butterfly, and therefore it's very, very dependent on that one species. The parasitic wasp, what it does is to lay an egg inside the caterpillars of the marsh fritillary. That will then start to eat them. and it will leave the vital organs until last, and then obviously the caterpillar is dead. And then it sort of emerges out and goes into a cocoon and spends a while like that, and then emerges as an adult wasp and goes off to go and find some more caterpillars to do it again. So it's again a sort of fascinating species, but you can imagine with all of those different things going on, it needs everything to kind of align nicely for it. Otherwise, it's not going to survive. So here's some more points why we need grasslands. Public health and well-being. So we know that time spent outside and in nature is good for everyone's mental and physical health, and there's a mounting body of evidence to say that that's the case. So we need spaces like this to go out to in our environment to enjoy. They also have cultural and historical significance. So they're obviously really, really stunning, peaceful, beautiful places, and they've long been inspiring our artists and writers. They also were, part of that landscape. When we talk about the history of grasslands and why they were there, it's important to recognise that as well. They are low cost to manage, so they don't require inputs in the same way. So they don't need fertilising. They're managed with a sort of single hay cut or some grazing. So relative to other types of habitat or to other types of farming, they're low cost. And they provide health benefits to livestock as well. So many of the species that we have within our wildflower grasslands have got specific properties that help to keep our livestock healthy. So they're really high in minerals. Some of them have anthelmintic properties, so they can help reduce the parasite burden. And they can also aid with digestion. And they used to be referred to, species-rich grasslands like this, as medicine fields, because farmers would know that they could take their poorly livestock and put them in, and they would be able to self-select the specific species that they needed to be well again. And we've got a really nice example here of a specific species that's particularly good. This is sainfoin, which is a legume, and translated from French, it sort of means loosely healthy hay. And this is because it's a particularly palatable species that used to be included within hay, and it's got various properties that mean that it's great. So it helps to put on protein and for animals to gain weight without causing bloat. It's also a really high yielding forage plant for bumblebee species, long-tongued bumblebees and solitary bees. And it copes really well with our kind of Cotswold soil, so it's quite deep rooting, and it does well within our grasslands. And 100 years ago in the Cotswolds, apparently 1 in 7 fields was turned over to sainfoin, so it's quite a local sort of species that was really popular at one time. These grasslands can also provide an income, so obviously recognising that we've lost much of these types of habitats now, there are specific schemes that exist to pay for these grasslands to be included on a farm or on the land. These have recently been kind of readjusted, and we will talk a little bit about that later, to increase the payment rates on having these specific grasslands. And they tend to do better in locations on the farm where you wouldn't necessarily want to be growing your crops. So obviously we know that they like soils that are low in nutrients and kind of low fertility. They do quite well on sloping ground because of the free draining aspect and because of the amount of sun that they can get. And so it's not necessarily a case of taking land out of arable production to turn over to wildflower grassland, but it's about trying to find ways to include that within the landscape, because we know that they're really important and that they can fit with that kind of farming scene when we talk about being able to use them for grazing livestock as well. So last couple of points on why we need grasslands. Carbon storage. So I've got some facts there. In Great Britain, permanent grasslands have been estimated to store more than 2 billion tonnes of carbon to a depth of 100 centimetres. So I was trying to work out what that means or what that equates to, and kind of converting that into carbon dioxide and looking at what that amount of carbon dioxide from emissions would have been. I found some figures, and it looked like that was the total global emissions from fossil fuels and industry from 2004. So we're talking about big amounts of carbon storage. It's also very stable carbon storage as well, because 90% of the carbon stored within grasslands is stored underground. So it's in the roots and in the soil, not in the above ground biomass. So what that means is, as opposed to woodlands where it's kind of locked up in the trees above the ground, and therefore they are more susceptible to things like fires or pests or disease. Grasslands are as long as they don't get ploughed up, it's in there and it's doing its job. And when we talk about species-rich grasslands as well, we see that there's an increase in the amount of carbon that is stored within those grasslands compared to just ryegrass grasslands, because of the ability of some of these wildflowers to be deep-rooting and to help store carbon within the soil. And then lastly, flood management. So grasslands can help us to regulate and store water. Obviously, floodplain meadows being, one that particularly that's the case for. But they can also help by buffering rainwater and runoff, and by reducing soil erosion as well. So hopefully you'll get the picture now that I like grasslands. So that's why we need to be doing this. But how do we do it? So how do we go about doing that within the Glorious Cotswold Grasslands team? So let's talk a little bit about that, and we'll talk about longer term management as well. So we've talked a little bit already about some of these aspects of grasslands that make them suitable, but one of the big jobs for us in the team in the winter is to go out and find the restoration sites that we want to work on through the summer months and into the autumn. So we're lucky enough to have quite a few landowners come to us wanting to have wildflower grasslands on their land, but we need to go and have a look and see how suitable they are for restoration. So we're looking for these features here. So a south or west facing aspect is best, but open and sunny is what we're looking for. Free draining, and particularly if we're talking about calcareous grassland habitats. We want access to grazing if possible, or access to contractors for cutting or cutting machinery, or at least a willingness to kind of get that management right going forwards. We want these opportunities to be close to existing wildflower grasslands wherever possible, because as we've already discussed, we want to be working within that nature recovery network. And when we go to look at these grasslands, we're also looking for some meadow grasses and some sort of botanical interest. So we want to see that some of those indicator species are still within that grassland, because that helps us to know that they obviously were there once and that the conditions within the ground are suitable. So there's a number of tools that we can use to do this. Obviously, we can look at the Nature Recovery Network, and that can help us to identify where we might be best placed to use our resources and our time. But we can also look at geological maps of what's going on under the soil. Ideally, we can ask people about the history of the sites, but that's not always known. So if we don't know, we can also do soil testing. So there are a number of different nutrients in the soil that we can look at to find out, the suitability for restoration, but the key one being phosphorus. So this is one of the things that is added as a fertilizer, and it favours competitive grasses. So it's not what we want in our wildflower grasslands. So we're looking for sites that are low in phosphorus when we're looking for ideal restoration sites. So once we think we've found a site that looks like it's going to be good for restoration, what we do next is to go in and take our baselining. So we're undertaking botanical surveys so that we can see what's already in there, and that will help us not only have a baseline from which we can say, well, we know that we took it from this habitat type to this habitat type, but it helps us to understand how we're going to get it there and to make a plan. So there's a number of different types of surveys that we can do. We were using a methodology called grid square mapping, and that's the map shown on the slide, where we split the site into 50-metre grids. And what we do is walk around the site, making sure that we go into each of those grids, and we're looking for those indicator species. So we've got lists of particular indicators that we're looking for across different types of grasslands. And the presence of different numbers of those indicator species would allow us to create a sort of spatial map with some really nice spatial data about like a sort of heat map. So what we'd be hoping for is to take something like this one and then in a few years go back and see it much more colourful, showing that we've been able to increase the number of indicators on that site. But more so now we're moving towards something called quadrat sampling. So we're putting down a metre square quadrat on the ground. We're placing 10 of those evenly across the site within each type of distinct habitats, if there are different distinct habitats, or across the whole site as a whole. And within that, we're identifying all of the species that we can see. And then across the whole site, we get a sense of the frequency of those different species. And then we can use the UK Habitats classification system, which tells us which type of grassland we've got. But having that information, obviously, we can then formulate a plan to take the habitat from A to B. And that allows us to move on with our next step in the restoration. So after we finish those surveys in May and June, we're out seed harvesting. So through July into September, depending on the weather conditions as well, we're out collecting this wildflower seed from donor sites across the Cotswolds using a towed brush seed harvester. So a big ethos for our project is the idea that we should be, where we can, collecting local seed and using that in our restorations as local to those sites we've collected it as possible. And this is because doing it in this way, we can preserve the genetics of the native wildflower species. So it is possible to buy commercially grown wildflower seed, but you don't always know where that seed originally came from. And quite often, those species have been selected for vigour, or they might be hybrids, and so they don't always look all that much like what the native species look like. And so obviously for our pollinators, we want them to look like the native species, but also I think if we take seed from the locality and introduce it somewhere else locally, it just feels like we're going to have a better chance of restoration success. So we're lucky enough to have a sort of whole host of donor sites, very generous landowners who support us and allow us to collect wildflower seed from their beautiful meadows. And so we undertake a botanical survey in all of our donor sites as well, so that we know what type of grassland it is, and we know what to expect within the seed mix when we come to collect from them. And then the idea is then that we'll match up the seed from the donor sites to the restoration sites. So we can look at a number of factors there to match them up. So we'll look at, where they are, obviously trying to keep the distance between the sites as close as possible. But we can look at aspect, we can look at vegetation type and dampness, and all sorts of different factors that allow us to match up the seed to where we need to restore. So the brush seed harvester, it works, it's a tow behind, it's got a petrol-driven brush and a deflector bar. And so what we can do is to adjust the height of the deflector bar to hit the sort of seed heads of the specific flowers that we're looking to collect the seed from, or generally to match the height of the sward. And then as we drive through the grassland, the seed heads hit the deflector and flick into the path of the brush. The brush combs through the seed head and flicks the seed back into the hopper. And so then it's a case of taking our, driving the towed harvester over a tarp on the ground. And this is where we have the help of our wonderful volunteers. So through the summer, we normally have 2 volunteers out with us every single day, because there's a huge amount of energy and resource that needs to go into doing this. But we empty the seed out, and it then needs sieving by hand to try and remove any sort of chaff and stalks and seed heads and things, maybe flower heads that might have been caught up in the mix. So we can take that out, and then we can spread the seed across the tarp on a big surface area in the sun, hopefully in the sun. And we have the volunteers kind of turn it and through the day and rake it to allow it to dry out as much as possible on the day in the field. And then it's a case of bagging it up as quick as possible and getting it back to the barn. We'll then do the same process. So we lay it out and continue to turn it and dry it over the coming days and weeks until it's completely dry, and then we can bag it up and label it and store it. So we do have to be a little bit cautious about obviously our donor sites. We tend to only go back on sort of 2 or 3 year rotations to make sure that we're not collecting too often from the same meadow, because obviously these are our existing core habitats that we spoke about within that nature recovery network, and we want to make sure that we are following best practice for those. We estimate that the seed harvester actually collects somewhere in the region of about 30% of the seed, and obviously the yield that we get will vary depending on the weather conditions and quite how ripe that seed is when we come to collect from that site. A lot of it is probably also just knocked to the ground before we have a chance to flick it back into the hopper. So I think what we're finding is that actually possibly the donor sites are benefiting in some situations from having a little bit of sort of disturbance and those seeds kind of knocked down into the ground. And I just wanted to focus a little bit about a kind of star player in our seed mix. This is yellow rattle, or the meadow maker. And obviously for us, when we come to do our overseeding, this is really important because if we're overseeding into existing grassland, what we want to happen is to reduce those grasses so that the wildflowers within the seed mix that we're introducing have opportunities to get established. But grasses, as we know, can be quite competitive and quite overpowering. And this is where yellow rattle comes in. So it's a facultative hemiparasite. And what that means is that it's able to produce its own carbohydrates, so it can survive on its own, but it doesn't want to. It wants to latch onto something and steal all the nutrients in the water from that instead. And it's quite greedy, so it'll try and have several hosts at once if it can as well. It's really clever how it does this. So it's got a special organ called a haustorium, and the haustorium latches on to the roots of the host, and it has enzymes that break down the tissue in the roots of the host plant so that the yellow rattle can attach its sort of vascular tissues into the roots of the host. And then what it does is it needs to draw out all the sugars and the water from the host. So it opens the stomata, that's the pores in the leaves, really wide. And what that means is the water escapes from the yellow rattle and creates a negative water potential, so that it can draw out those sugars and nutrients. And in that way, it's estimated that it can steal something in the region of 20% of the phosphorus and potassium and nitrogen and water from the host plants. So it does do a really good job of knocking back those grasses and stealing from other plants in the grassland. But why doesn't it attach to our wildflowers? Well, some of these have developed special ways to resist yellow rattle from being able to attach. So there's oxeye daisy, which has a thickened layer of lignin in its root tissues that the haustorium can't penetrate. And another one is ribwort plantain, which has a special sort of trigger where when it detects the haustorium trying to attach from a yellow rattle, it kills its own tissues surrounding that organ so that it can't latch on. So there's lots of clever kind of adaptations in the grassland there. But yellow rattle is really a key player for us because it really does help knock the grasses back. And what we tend to see is that it goes in these sort of boom and bust populations again. So it proliferates really rapidly as it has the ability to attach to more and more grasses, and it proliferates by self-seeding, and it's an annual. And then it sort of drops down once it's basically, eaten all of the things that it can, and then has to survive on its own. So it naturally sort of settles back down to a level where it's having to provide its own carbohydrates and it has less grasses to parasitize. And again, that creates more of an opportunity and more of an opening in the grassland for our wildflowers to get established. The seeds of yellow rattle need to be put down in the autumn. So it does mean that we do have to do a lot of our seeding in the autumn because it needs vernalization. So it needs frosts over the winter that kind of trigger its germination, and then it appears in the spring. And those seeds of the yellow rattle they're quite short-lived, so they'll live for 12 to 18 months. So before we put our seed down, we need to prepare our ground. So for that, we need to have short grass. So we need to go in and have the grass cut, and crucially have those cuttings taken off. And then we're looking to create bare ground within that grassland as well. So somewhere in the region of 20 to 30%. And we can do that with chain harrows or disc harrows, or a scarify, or even a flail on the grass cutter as it goes over and collects it. If you can run it low enough, you can kind of scuff the ground up at the same time. But what's crucial about that is that we don't go too deep. So we're just looking to do this at surface level. And that's because we don't want to create loads of bare soil where that sort of level of disturbance will mean that lots of things come in. So flush up, like stinging nettles and docks and the things that like those kind of opportunities. But we also don't want to disturb what's in the seed bed too much because, again, those species will pop up and compete with our wildflowers. And then we can introduce the seed. So we have to broadcast our seed in the autumn if we're talking about overseeding, but we can do it in the spring if it's a bare soil site. And we have to broadcast our seed by hand on the whole, because it's not cleaned to the same extent as many sort of commercially grown and cleaned seed is. So it still does contain some element of kind of husks and stems and things as well. And also the vast array of different seeds that we have in there, they're all different shapes and sizes. And in just one handful, you might have thousands of different seeds. So if we're lucky and we've got vehicles, we can whiz around and kind of throw the seed out off the back of a truck or something. But otherwise it is a case of people power. So we have to call in our team of ACE volunteers with lots of buckets to spread out across the site and broadcast our seed for us. And then it's a case of waiting. So we go back in the following spring, and that's when we're able to kind of have a look at how successful we think we've been in the first instance. So what we're looking for there really is that yellow rattle when we're talking about restoration sites. And we want to see something like this. So all those little crinkly leaves shown in the photo are yellow rattle, and you can really see quite how vigorous it can be when the ground preparation is right and when it likes the conditions where it's gone in. And what we tend to see is obviously a sort of gradual build of yellow rattle over the first few years. And then we might start to see the basal rosette, so the leaves of the wildflowers. And most of the wildflowers that we're introducing are perennials. They're long-lived and they can last quite a lot longer than the yellow rattle seed. So it might be a little while before they start to appear. But then we'll see gradually as that yellow rattle starts to knock back the grasses, we'll start to see those wildflowers appear. And sometimes it can be quite fast. So we've got some case studies here. The picture on the left was taken from a field behind the old prison in Northleach. So the A40 there had some subsidence and they had to do some landscaping work on the field below the road. So this was a bare soil site. We put the seed in 2021, I think, and then this photo was taken in the first summer following on from that. And you can see that there's a huge number of different species that have already popped up, including the kidney vetch, and then the small blue butterfly that feeds on the kidney vetch was also recorded in there. So a lovely example of create the habitat and then see the species come. And then the next picture is from Windrush Village, where we did one of the road verges belonging to the parish council. And that was 2 years in. But again, you can see a really nice flush of oxeye daisy and sandfoin that's kind of taken hold. So once we think we've got our wildflower grassland kind of established, the longer term management that we need then is excluding the livestock from the field, if there are livestock, because we need those wildflowers to be able to flower and set seed. And that's because of obviously wanting to support the insect life. If we can leave the cutting until later, then we will. But that hay cut tends to be from sort of mid-July through to August. And again, kind of depending on whether that is going to go for hay. Also, if there are livestock that are able to graze the standing hay, then it's also nice to do that at low levels. But crucially, at some point in that sort of late summer period, it's going to need cutting or grazing to reduce those nutrients. And then you can graze again through the winter until the sort of soil gets too wet. And longer term, obviously we've spoken about this process of succession and sort of scrub. But we, through the winter months of our programme, what we do is to go out and help on sites where perhaps the management hasn't been quite right and that grazing or cutting hasn't taken place. We do like scrub. Scrub in its own right is a brilliant habitat, and it's fantastic for adding complexity and mosaics into our environment. And obviously it's shelter and food for lots of different species. So we always aim to reduce rather than eradicate scrub on our sites. We do like to see some, but obviously sometimes it can be a bit too much, and it does have a tendency to keep creeping out and trying to spread. So again, here we've got our brilliant volunteers giving us a hand with cutting back some scrub on a nice calcareous grassland, and strimming in place of grazing or cutting. So quite often these are on steep slopes where it's not possible to get in cutting machinery, but we can go in with a team of people and brush cutters and trim and crucially rake off those grasses. So a couple of slightly more local before and afters of some of our habitat management. So we've got a calcareous grassland slope in Hillesley where we did some scrub control, and at the Millennium Green in Ewley, there's a nice south-facing calcareous bank that hadn't been cut or grazed, so we did a job of strimming and raking there as well. So I'm just going to finish with a little bit of information about funding. So how can we make this happen? And if you're interested in doing something like this or advising somebody else on how they might be able to fund this type of thing, a little bit of information on that, and then we'll finish on how you can get involved. So we have some partnerships with water companies that help us to do our work. Severn Trent Water covers us in the kind of west of the Cotswolds, and it covers for us the sort of all those initial intervention things that we do. So it'll cover the botanical visit and the cost of the seed and the cost of the seed spreading, and a contribution towards the ground prep. And then the Thames Water, which is within the even load catchment, has sort of 50% match funding with the landowner for the latter part of that ground prep and the seed. And then we've got a partnership with National Highways, which was the programme that brought me into the team last year. And this covers 100% of those upfront costs of the initial work that we do to do that restoration. But it also comes with management payments for the landowner, and that will help them to cover the costs of getting the grazing or taking that hay cut. This is a really long-term project, so it's got those payments available for 30 years, and it does come with a sort of, therefore, like a management agreement to make sure that that's kind of secured for that time period. And there's various payment schemes for farmers. And I did make a slight reference to that before, but we've got farming in protected landscapes, which we can put together a restoration programme and fund it through FIPL, and it will cover up to 100% of those upfront costs, but it's also great for providing funding for capital costs like the fencing and the grazing infrastructure on those grasslands that maybe need a bit of management. And then there's environmental land management schemes. Now there's different tiers of this, but the kind of key one for us, and the one that's caught a bit more attention recently, is the countryside stewardship, which has got 3 options for managing, creating and restoring species-rich grasslands, and the payment rates for those have recently sort of doubled or tripled, which was a really positive step. But overall, countryside stewardship rates have gone up by 10% across the board. And then if these sorts of schemes aren't really the right sort of thing, we also work with landowners who are really happy just to finance this for themselves, and they want to have it on their land, or maybe they're not applicable through the various different programmes or funding streams that we've already spoken about. So we can do botanical surveys at cost, and we can also put people in touch with contractors and graziers to help get the ground prepared, and then we can sell the wildflower seed. So we try and do that. We're a not-for-profit, and we try and do that at a cost that really just covers our time and maintaining our kit and our storage spaces. But we want to try and make it as accessible to as many people as possible, because that's ultimately our aim. So ways to support the programme. If you think you could create a wildflower meadow, please do. In your garden, small holding, wherever you think you might have a bit of land and you think it would be suitable. Obviously, we can give some advice and guidance on that as well. But talk to your friends and neighbours. Think about community spaces where you think this might be possible, and where you think there could be opportunities to do this. You could volunteer with us. So we do the winter work parties, the seed spreading, the seed harvesting, and the botanical surveys as well. So there's lots of different ways to kind of get involved with the work that we do through the programme. And all of it is outside, some of it in the wet and some of it in the extreme heat, depending on which season we're in and what it's doing. But it's really good fun, and we really, really value the time that the volunteers put in, because there's just 2 of us at the moment in the team, about to be 3, but there's only so much work that we can do with just 2 of us. You could make a donation to the programme, but also crucially spread the word. So if you think you know somebody who might have some land that's suitable for restoration, do put them in touch with us. Speak to your neighbours and friends and things about it. But we're also looking for places where we might be able to collect wildflower seed, contractors and graziers who might have the right kit, so that we can put them in touch with the landowners who need that help to manage their grasslands. So talking about what we do is also a really, really good way to help us. So that's us, myself and Anna, and hopefully having someone starting soon. And thank you so much for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Lorna. That was absolutely amazing. I mean, the level of detail in some of those things was absolutely fascinating. I'm never going to look at yellow rattle in the same way again. But as Lorna says, she's happy to take some questions. So does anybody have any questions for her? So there's the management that you tend to do in grasslands, it can go quite well with specific types of fungi. So I know that when I was working over in South Wales, there were some triple SIs that were designated specifically because they had huge numbers of waxcap fungi. Those were existing in grasslands that were quite species rich, but they were always kept really short. And those types of conditions seem to really suit those waxcap fungi. So yeah, certainly I think that there's room for all of these things to exist. But yeah, I totally agree that obviously anything we can do that's going to minimize disturbance of the soil, to allow things like the mycorrhizae to be within the soil, to allow those deep structured roots from the wildflowers, it's all going to help capture carbon, and where we can, obviously that's going to be fantastic to do that. Maybe I should write to him and see if he wants to do yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, that would be fantastic. They are, I mean, obviously they are a habitat that are so complex, and there are so many different interactions between the species that exist in grasslands. I do find it really fascinating, and I think looking at those specific interactions kind of really bring these things to life, and makes you really appreciate quite how much we need them if we're going to continue to support the species that we need to exist. So this is something that we're sort of looking into a little bit more, I would say, more recently. So through the winter this year, we did work with a golf course, Cirencester Golf Course, and they've got an area of calcareous grassland that hasn't been cut or grazed. And they're lucky that they've got a really switched on keeper there who's really interested in the topic, and he was very keen to invite us along to have a look, and noting that it's really quite special. There's lots of orchids in there and things. So we took our volunteer team, but we'll be collaborating with them longer term to make sure that we can support them in any way that we can to get that area managed in the way that it needs for the wildflowers. Yeah, I think this is something we probably will need to consider a little bit more, because we need to find opportunities where we can, and people who have land that might be suitable. A lot of the golf courses that we have around here tend to be right up on those commons at the very top, where we know that the soil is poor and limey and really very suitable for wildflowers. So if we can make those relationships work, then definitely that's an avenue that needs our time putting to it. Thanks. Yeah, so as a conservation board and as a national landscape, we sort of sit on those boards and those collaborations when we talk about landscape scale species recovery and what we need to do to get that right. So my line manager, Simon Smith, is a really, really experienced person when it comes to talking about landscape scale restoration. And he was involved in some work that the National Landscape did looking at natural capital. So there's a platform on our website that you can visit, and what it is an assessment of all the different types of habitats that we have and where the opportunities are. But rather than it being quite so focused on spatial scale and the nature recovery network, there are some specific figures on there. So it's broken down across each of the different types of potential that different habitat types have. So within it, when we talk about our core habitats, there's a sort of buffer zone that's drawn around each one, and at varying degrees of how successful we think that will be in buffering that particular habitat type. And you can look on there, and there's information for grassland, for example, on how many hectares of land falls within that specific area, where if we were to do restoration, it would help us to buffer and create and extend those key wildlife sites. I can't give you a figure off the top of my head, but it's another really interesting and useful platform to go and have a look at for those particular numbers. But the other thing on that is that the Cotswold National Landscape is also involved in our sort of strategy going forward. So we also have a management plan for the Cotswolds, and that talks about a number of different things. But for the next 5 years, that's got some key figures about how we're going to mitigate against climate change, and that covers a range of things like energy and environment as well. So there's some figures in there. Yeah, so we definitely recognise what you're saying there is true. So we do sometimes work with green hay. For that situation, it's just a case of finding a site that's close enough to where we want to restore to be able to move the hay, because as soon as you've cut it, and looking at kind of when we're doing this, obviously it's normally in the summer on a dry day, it's only viable for a certain amount of time. And what can happen in really hot temperatures is that the seed cooks. So as long as we can get a donor site close enough to our restoration site that we can basically cut that hay and then take it straight over and put it down on the ground and let the seed get on the ground, then we do that. And definitely we recognise that grazing is a more traditional way of managing grasslands, and there's lots of benefits that come from grazing animals. The different way that they eat the vegetation, whether they rip it or whether they select it, the disturbance from the hooves and creating little pockets of bare soil that wildflowers can then colonize. Also the dung and the insect life that can be supported by that. These are all things that we do definitely recognize, but I think we all face a bit of a situation, specifically in Gloucestershire, but within our area with TB and with challenges around keeping livestock. So really it's just a case for us of trying to find the landowners who have those animals. But yeah, they definitely have a place in the landscape, and we do need them. We do need them to manage these habitats. Yeah, I think the bare soil sites, obviously there's less competition. So depending on what your soil type is there, and making sure that you put the right species mix in, then hopefully you'll get good results. I think a bit of that is where the soil has come from, and because there might be seeds within that and because it's so open and bare, obviously it can be colonized really easily. So that's just a case of being aware that there might be species that pop up in that compete with your wildflowers, but on the whole that can happen. So the Northleach example was a really good situation where we had bare soil and then lots of things came. So it can be quicker certainly than the overseeding, where obviously within that situation we're relying on the yellow rattle to knock the grasses back. So that is a slower process. What we do is to go back and do these repeat surveys. So I mentioned that we go back in the spring, but we do go back. I think it kind of depends on the situation, but we'll be monitoring that going forwards on a sort of cycle of either yearly or twice yearly, every other year rather, so that we can monitor it. If we've already got grassland, then we'll overseed. Yeah, we wouldn't kind of strip it all bare and then put the seed down. Our preference would be to overseed into the existing grassland, assuming that, yeah, all of those kind of factors, when we've assessed that, look like it's going to be a good restoration site. Yeah, so there are resources online. I think there's quite a lot of information that came out of that Save Our Grasslands Magnificent Meadows project, and Plant Life have loads of resources around specific different communities of grasslands and indicator species, but they've also got loads of information about restoring grasslands as well, and kind of how-to guides and things. So that's a good place to look. There are training courses that you can go on, and we did. At the moment, there's 2 of us, so it's all a bit pushed for time, but we did previously run some training courses. I don't know whether we'll manage any this year, but that's something we'd look to do when we have got another team member in, and we can, run some days and also we do occasionally guided walks as well, where we can kind of go out and show people a bit more casually in the field, this is this, and this is how you identify it. Yeah, I think the ability to go out into the landscape and work with people who have private land holdings and discrete areas of land that nobody would be aware of because there's no public access there. We have found some really fantastic sort of secret hidden valleys in the Cotswolds where it's ready for restoration. So where those opportunities exist, yeah, it's fantastic. And although it's a shame that not everybody can enjoy them, there is a place for that, because we do want to see those habitats undisturbed and doing well.
Okay. Well, I'd just like to say one final thank you to Lorna for what's been a really fascinating evening. Great to hear such a positive message about what's going on in the Cotswolds. Some really exciting stuff. And I'd like to give a shout out for livestock as well. They do a much better job than us going out with our brush cutters on Coombe Hill, that's for sure. So, so thank you, Lorna, anyway. That's brilliant.